Okay. So previously, we have learned how to use APIs from the front end when we were using the Pokemon API. Was that last week? Yeah. But so today we're going to learn how to use APIs from the back end. So I just draw a really quick diagram. Last week we were going from front end to an API, sending a request, and then that API sent a response back to the front end where we could display that information in the browser to the client. Today, we're going to be using APIs with a slightly different flow. The front end is going to send a request to our backend, and then our backend is going to send a request to the API, which returns a response to our backend, who returns the response to the front end. So we can say that we are proxying the request through our backend. Our backend is basically serving as this middleman between our front end and the API. Now, there are a couple of reasons why we might want to do this. So the first reason why we might want to send in an API request through our backend like this is that many APIs require authentication. So you're going to want to perform the actual API request on the backend to keep your credentials secret. Okay, and so then the other reason, which is a little bit more complicated, is that some APIs just cannot be used from the front end due to the same origin principle. All right, so I want to take a minute to explain this, and I'm really hoping people can ask questions if they're confused or if they've heard about this before in other contexts. These are two concepts that are pretty important. These are definitely things that you're going to bump up against as a web developer, but for whatever reason, most developers either don't understand how these things work or they are actively misunderstanding these principles. So if you're able to talk intelligently about these two acronyms here, you will be a step ahead of most junior or even intermediate developers. Like most people have no idea what these things do, and they just throw code at their application until it stops throwing errors without actually learning anything. So I would like us to actually understand what these acronyms mean. Let's just do some Googling real quick. Same origin policy. Yeah, let's get something from MDN. So a lot of great articles you can read on this, but I'm going to kind of summarize it for you. Basically, when you send an AJAX request with your browser cares very much about what origin you're sending that request to, and it's different. And if it's different from the origin that you're on currently. So an origin is, the website you're at, but it's not like the full path. Like this all here, English, US docs, that's not part of the origin. We're just concerned with the protocol. So is it HTTP or HTTPS? And then the base URL. So subdomain, the domain, and then the top level domain. So this part on the left here, this is the origin. So when we send an AJAX request, the same origin policy requires that the destination that we're sending the request to has the same origin as where we send the request from. So for the most part, this isn't an issue because our front end is just going to be sending requests to our back end. And so that's the same origin. So it's not going to cause us any problems there. So yeah, by default, you can only send a request to another URL with the same origin. Now, if you try to send a request outside of the origin that you're on, then what happens is it does actually send the request successfully. But when you receive the response, your browser is going to say like, hey, this response came from a different origin. It's not intended for this website to use. So I'm not going to make the response accessible to JavaScript. Not sure if that's actually described right here. You don't need to be here. Danielle?
Yep, this is, I'm sorry if I'm not following, but this is for the case when you send, like in a function, you send multiple requests and then I don't remember how it was that you send multiple requests and then you solve them all in the same function, or is it like different calls?
So this could apply even to a single request. If I'm using like Axios and sending an HTTP request to basically any API that is not expecting to receive requests from the front end, it's going to fail. And I'm going to get this cross-origin resource sharing error.
Right, because I was wondering, for example, in the Pokemon example, there was one that we were sending multiple requests to the API. And that, I guess that has to be from the same origin when you try to resolve them all, like all the requests, or is it like that I cannot send a request in a different function to, like in a different block to another API?
So yeah, it's just about the URL that you're on currently, and then where you're trying to send the request to. So like if I build a website, mywebsite.com, and in that website, I'm trying to send an AJAX request to some other website, when I get the response back, my browser is going to refuse to use it, refuse to make it accessible in JavaScript because it came from a different origin. It doesn't matter how many requests I'm sending, a single request to a different origin is going to be forbidden.
Okay.
See, I'll try to show you an example of that in a second. So yeah, this is kind of the default state of things, the same origin principle. You cannot send requests to sites with different origins. And the exception to this is called CORS. So optionally, a server that is expecting to receive cross-origin requests I think it's called I think that's what the header looks like. Access control allow origin star.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, yeah, access control allow origin star. So this is saying that you're basically disabling the same origin policy for this request. That if a response has this header on it, then any client is allowed to use that response. I'm going to try to show you an example of that before we get too deep into things. Let me create a quick demo with JavaScript. I'm going to see if I can just show you what I'm talking about. Why is my autocomplete not working all of a sudden? Clearly broke something.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what you were saying, Raphael, like the thing that like same origin policy and cross origin policy stuff is meant to avoid is you go to a website and the page loads and it runs some JavaScript that uses Ajax to make an HTTP request to some random server that, you know, like a hacker has set up, like a black hat hacker, and it loads malicious code. Like you can make a HTTP request and get more JavaScript from JavaScript. So what if all of a sudden the JS on your website talks to some server and loads some other JavaScript that is now logging all your keystrokes? Which is maybe a little contrived. I may have gotten some of the details wrong, but that's sort of just the general picture of what we want to avoid.
I mean, generally speaking, like this is, you know, a security feature and it's enabled by default for good reasons. You know, what I was showing you, this header here, access control allow origin star, this is appropriate for an API server where you actually want everyone on the internet to be able to access your information. It's not appropriate for the applications we're going to be building, where really our backend should only be accessed by our own front end. There's no reason why other front ends should be accessing our backends unless we're expecting them specifically. So like I see a lot of developers that just don't understand how to get their API working. So they just put this header on all their responses, but that just means that they're disabling like a universal security feature because they don't understand how to work with it. So I'm going to try to explain to you how it actually works, how to work with it. So here. So this is an API that we're going to be using in this demo. I'm going to explain it more shortly, but I just want to show you real quickly. Actually, this might not work how I'm hoping. We'll see what happens. Okay, yes. Did get the result I was looking for. Because there was a couple of reasons why this was going to fail, and I wasn't sure what was going to fail first. But this is that CORS error that I was talking about. So if we look in the network tab, we can see that my browser did send a request and we got a response, got a 400 status code response. But note on the response headers, there's nothing about access control allow origin. So that CORS header I was mentioning is not present here at all. This server, this API is not expecting to receive cross-origin requests. And so my browser is just refusing to process the data.
So because it happens at the browser level, right? So the data actually is sent in the request. It's just that your browser sees that it's not allowed because it doesn't have the CORS header, the correct CORS header. So it just blocks that data from being seen, or?
Right, that's my understanding. In this situation, like your server is not a cop. Your server doesn't particularly care what the client does with the data. So like we could use curl, for example, to send any request to any API and use the data, because curl doesn't respect the same origin principle. Like curl doesn't have an origin to begin with. You're just running it from the command line. It's only in browsers where we have this kind of security feature to protect the user.
So I wanted to ask, I was curious to find that header on because I'm assuming that the Pokemon API probably has that header in there. So I went back to my Pokemon project and opened it in my live server. But when I click on my network, there's nothing in there. So how do I find that information?
Let's try it out. Let me take a look. Okay, so we did get a response on Ditto. Cool. So yeah, clicked on that API request. And then in the response headers, right at the top, we see access control allow origin star. So this is a specific header that the Pokemon API is deliberately setting because they are intending for their responses to be used on the front end. They want any server or any client, any browser from any website should be able to access the Pokemon API and get their data. No restrictions. But so that's the difference between the Pokemon API and the Noun project API we're going to be using later today is this header. So because this is missing from the API we'll be using today, we're going to have to use other techniques to access their data. Do we have any questions about headers so far? All right, let's move on then. So I keep talking about authentication and keys for these APIs. So let's actually talk about that a little bit. Delete that guy. So yeah, lots of APIs require keys. You'll generally get a pair of keys, a public and a private key, that are associated with your account with the API for billing purposes generally. So it's really important that you keep them secret because if someone else gets your keys, they can impersonate you and you might end up getting charged a lot of money. So let's see, today we're going to be using the Noun project API. Let me go to our curriculum here, got a link to it. So yeah, every API is different. You're really going to have to read their documentation in order to understand how they work. So I've got a link here to the docs for the Noun project. It's a pretty nice little getting started guide. They tell you to create an API key. So once you have logged in, so first you have to register and then log in, you can go to their app management page. So we'll click through there. And they want you to first create an app, which doesn't really mean anything. It's basically just saying that this key that you're going to create is associated with some particular use, some particular application. And then you can create other keys that are associated with other applications. It's just an organizational tool, but I only have one key for this API, so it doesn't really matter too much. But anyway, I've created one app called API demo. So I'm going to click on this guy. Gives me some information about it. Great. And then at the bottom, these are my keys. In the first place, when I did this the first time, I had to, click a button to generate my keys. But because I've already got an account, I've already got keys, I could recreate them. After this demo, I'm probably going to have to regenerate my keys because I'm recording them on this video right now, and then I'm going to post them to YouTube. So these credentials are going to get compromised this afternoon. So I'm going to have to regenerate these. Yeah, so you still might be kind of wondering, like, what the heck is all this? How do I use these keys? Well, they've got this handy dandy link over here. How do I use this thing? Let's click on it. Actually, this takes me back to the previous page, but just scroll down slightly. So they're telling me that we use OAuth for authentication. I'm not exactly sure how that works quite yet, but maybe I'll keep reading and it'll become clear. If I want to make requests, this is the URL that I send the requests to. And then they list their API endpoints that are the specific things I can do. Telling me about the responses that I can expect back, depending on the results, get the response in JSON format. Pricing is very generous. And then very fortunately, they show you some sample code. So if you're not exactly sure how to get started using this thing, they give you some samples in Python and Ruby. And then there's also some community tools, some libraries that make it easier to use this API, written in a few different languages. What do we notice though? What's missing from the list of languages that they provide tools and examples for?
We can only see Ruby right now.
So there's Python, Ruby, and then there's this list of wrappers under community tools. Pardon?
JavaScript?
Yeah, there's no option for JavaScript. They don't even mention it. So it's like what I was saying before, this API is not expecting to receive requests from browsers. It's expecting to receive requests from another backend. So all the documentation here is explaining how to use this API from other backend languages. So for us, this little Python snippet is going to be pretty useful. But before I start just building an application, I still kind of want to get a better idea of like what I'm doing, figure out how this thing works. So
Hey, Raphael, I know I'm like the queen of give me background, but like, can you give me a little bit of background on first, like what is this noun API? And like you mentioned that there's public and secret keys.
mm-hmm.
How would you know which one your project needs to use? Because you mentioned you'll find some of that in the documentation, but is that like a specific API will always require a secret key. And so then you know that if you want to use that API, you'll have to have a secret key, or do APIs have secret and public? And then somewhere in the documentation, it says, if you want to do these things with our API, you'll need a secret one. But if you only want to access this, you'll need a public one. Or how do we do that?
Most APIs will require both a public and private key. But if you read the documentation, they'll tell you how to handle them, how to use the keys. Yeah, the most important thing here is you've got to read the documentation, because every API is different. There's no way that I would know this stuff offhand. Here we go. I was looking for the API Explorer. So if I just don't really know what I'm doing, I can use this little online graphical tool that lets me use their API. They have a whole bunch of different endpoints. The ones that I'm interested in are the icon endpoints. Oh, I'm sorry. You were asking about background. Like, what the heck is this? The noun project is just an API that gives you pictures of things. That's all it does. But I mean, specifically, they're like black and white icons, but of basically anything you can imagine. So I think that's pretty cool. I don't know why you'd use this like for professional purposes, because you would probably like have a specific icon already that you know and that you like. So this is just for like searching spontaneously for icons, but it's kind of cool for this demo at least. But yeah, so I want to search for an icon. So let's search for icons by ID. They're telling me ID is a required parameter, and this is not. I don't know what that is. I don't really care. I'm gonna leave it blank. Put in 1. And so it's telling me I just send a request to this URL, and the response is forbidden 403. Don't have permission to access this resource. So the problem here is that these inputs are blank. Even just to use their little sandbox API Explorer, I have to use my API keys. So let me go back to, where was that? Here we go. So in my signed in account for the noun project, I just scroll down to the app section, got my keys. This is the public key. Put that in there. Here's the private key. Put that in there. Let's try this again. And so now I actually get an API response, this big old dictionary. And among other interesting information, we have a preview URL. I'm gonna just paste that URL into my browser, and apparently this is icon number 1 in their API. This guy throwing out trash. I don't remember the IDs for all their icons, so a little more interesting is searching for icons by term. Can anyone name a thing? Any? Pardon?
You got it, Maya.
Grapes.
Grapes.
How about programmer? Like Terrence said, that was a good one.
That one I'm not so sure if we'll find. That might be a little more esoteric. So there are grapes. Cool. Let's see, programmer. I'm a little less optimistic here.
That would be an amazing API.
Not found, unfortunately. That gives us a 404. Dude, do you have a picture of a programmer? I wonder what this guy looks like.
Someone needs to like create a programming icon and issue a like a pull request to the API or something.
Yeah, so it'd just be like this guy with his feet up, I think. Maybe there's a beer on the table. But yeah, so that's how the API works in general. I think I figured it out. I can send requests like this, and then it gives me this kind of response. I need to dig in and get the preview URL, and then I can see some pictures. Nathan, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just a little confused about the keys, I guess. Are they like passwords? Do you need to save your keys? And if so, like, what is the best practice for that? Do you like just save them in a document on your desktop? Do you save them in the browser somehow? Like what would, I guess, what's the deal with that?
Yep, that's a very important question. So first of all, so I'd say the key is really more like a username. This identifies who you are. And then the secret is more like a password. This proves that you are who you say you are. And then your second question, that's actually the last part of today's lecture, is we're going to talk about secret management and how to properly store these keys so that, you know, they don't get leaked out to the public.
There were 3 different preview URLs. Is there a reason for that?
Possibly different size images.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, 42 pixel image.
That's smaller actually. So I guess I was looking at the biggest one first. Okay.
Yeah, 242.84 pixels. Yeah, I get it. All right, cool.
Cool. I'm not sure why those specifically are the sizes they provide, but whatever.
Yeah, it's usually 32 and 64. Those are pretty weird numbers, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
So check your guide fans.
But yeah, so now I'd like to start actually building a Django application that uses this API. So I'm gonna have to go through some of my usual setup. So first I'm going to create a virtual environment. We're going to call this wishes environment. We're going to make an application that grants people's wishes. Okay, and then we will activate it. Cool, I got my prompt changed, so I know that worked correctly. Now I can install Django. Now I can use Django to create my project structure. So I got my wishes project. And it's not really necessary for such a small project, but I want us to get used to seeing the structure. So I'm going to create an app also. But now I've got the manage.py file, so I can do this. Oh, I have to. Oh, start app. That's right. Start app, and I also have to name it. This is the wishes app. Cool. So that's roughly right. Close this server. Done with that little demo. Choose the wishes project. And we'll run this guy. Run the server. Excuse me. Oh, right. I did not activate the virtual environment in this terminal, so I have to do that too. Port is in use. I disagree.
Raphael, I'm glad I'm not the only one who talks to my terminal. Like, no, that's not right. I think it's hilarious when you're like, what? No way. Get that out of here. What are you doing?
Yeah. Helps me stay sane. So looks like my previous server didn't actually get closed for some reason.
If you go to your browser and check localhost 8000, will it show you what's using it?
Yeah, I can see what's running there, but I need to. What? No, that is not what I was expecting actually. So it's a yet another server that is still running. Okay, I don't want to figure this out right now. I'm just going to run my Django server on a different port. Or wait, actually, is it over here? Or okay, yeah, it was actually just in this editor. Too many editors open.
I feel you, Raphael.
Raphael, can you explain quickly the two terminals that you have open? Are you gonna, do you have like one specified for one set of tasks and one for the other? Okay, it's kind of lost on me right now.
Yeah, so this first one is just for running the server, which after I start the server, this tab is like frozen, it's busy, so I can't use it for other stuff. So for just like, you know, CDing around, ls, doing Git stuff, any other interactive terminal things, I'm going to do this in the other terminal. Yeah, when I do things at the command line, I actually like to rename my terminal tabs. So like, gosh, where is it? I think if you're using iTurn2, it's easier to retitle the tabs. But for some reason in the default terminal, you have to like go through menus. But yeah, so when I'm like developing personally, when I'm not teaching, this is honestly what I like to do. Just to remind myself like what all my different tabs are for. So let's see, where are we? All right, so let's just see if the server is running. Cool. So this is the basic Django hello. So now I'm going to my wishes project. This is going to load in URLs from my wishes app. And I'm honestly just going to copy and paste that from my previous application. Great, except instead of polls, this is, I'm actually going to just put it at slash. And then we're actually including wishes app.urls. Excuse me. So then the wishes app needs urls.py. And just copy that contents from yesterday's demo again. And we're just going to have one route in this app. So we're going to have an index. And then in the views, got a couple of imports. And oh, I forgot this whole thing was collapsed. Don't need any of this. Let's just make sure that we're getting a request and a response here. So let's see, I'm getting an error already here. Module named wishesapp.urls. So I'm pretty sure I know what I messed up here, but does anyone have any ideas what this error is about, Michael?
You have to go into your settings.py and add the app to installed apps.
I do indeed.
Nice.
A bunch of other chat here. Other people have questions?
Zach found the editor autocomplete issue you ran into earlier, and it's in the resources channel just for later.
So what are we doing here?
While you're working on that, I just wanted to get confirmation. Garrett and I were looking at this last night. Can you not have comments in your HTML templates?
You can have comments. Why would you think you can't?
Well, because I wasn't able to render an HTML page when it had comments in there. So I had to take them out and then it would run. I was just doing the standard highlight control / thing in VS Code, and it was doing HTML comments, I guess.
So that's interesting. I think that your editor might potentially get confused because you're writing some like slightly turducken-y code here with the Django template syntax inside of your HTML syntax. So it might not know how to comment it out automatically. And there's also the question of, are you commenting out Django template stuff or are you commenting out HTML?
It's both.
So like here, this is a Django template comment, which means that the stuff inside of it doesn't appear in the rendered document that you send to the client. But if you do an HTML comment, then you actually do send a comment in the HTML file that you send to the client. So they're slightly different in what is actually—
An annoying distinction, just throwing it out there.
Pardon?
I said that's an annoying distinction. You had to like comment each line of your stuff differently based on if it's HTML or Django.
And whether or not you want the comment to appear actually in the front end or not. Yeah, it's definitely a little bit weird. Especially it's frustrating just that your editor isn't going to do it for you automatically. Or maybe if you have some kind of Django extension, it can, I don't know. But anyway, you can have comments in your Django templates, and this is how you do it.
Thanks.
You are welcome. Somebody send another request here to my app. And all right. So I'm trying to render a template that doesn't exist. Why don't I just make a template really quick? So in my wishes app, I need a folder for templates. inside of templates, I need this seemingly redundant subfolder for Wishes app. And then inside of that, I will create my index.html. Seriously not sure what happened to my autocomplete. Maybe my editor just heard me complaining about it and just shut off the feature.
Zach figured out it's the Django VS Code extension.
That'll let you comment things easily, or?
Oh, sorry, that messes with autocomplete.
Really?
Yeah, he put, if you look in the Slack resources channel, I grabbed it from the Zoom chat. He found a config editor config fix. So, or disabling, actually, that's a lot more effective. That's a great call.
I mean, it also means that I lose the syntax highlighting, which is not ideal.
Yeah.
I also just found out that if you're in a Django HTML and you do the control/, it'll add the comments the way it's supposed to.
Cool, that's nice to know.
Here, I'll rethrow the.
Well, yeah, just to add on to that, Zach, because I was working with it last night, I was highlighting like my entire block of code. I'm guessing you'd have to highlight the HTML, use that, and then highlight the Django separately.
So I threw in the Zoom chat too what Zach found to put in VS Code settings.json that should fix the autocomplete issue. But you're probably right, just disable it for now so that, you know, we don't get lost in settings.json. But yeah, all this stuff, by the way, folks, like, this is just like programming life, like figuring this stuff out and configuring editors. So it's good to do and it's good to see. And it's really cool to see that folks are like figuring stuff out and sharing it, which is awesome and much appreciated.
So something is missing here. I'm not sure what the issue is. Just going to restart my server. Okay, I guess Django wasn't able to see that I added a file while it was running. So I just restarted the server. So now it looks like it's finding my template.
Yeah, I've run into that with React stuff too. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I feel like you've mentioned this before, Adam, but just like if your application isn't working, you don't know why, just try restarting it just for your sanity, see if that changes anything.
Yeah, totally. So many times sometimes I'll quit the browser entirely because half the time we've been looking at the code so long that it's really hard for us to see the issue and sometimes just getting that fresh start. But yeah, what Raphael ran into is a really good point. Like the Django server does a lot of great work for us, like in watching files and when they change and like forcing a page refresh in the browser. But if we like create a new file or especially a new directory, it's not smart enough to catch that. And we'll see that with the stuff we use with like React too when we get there to help us. And I have had that eat up like probably hours of time over the years.
Anyways, sorry, what was that? Okay, so we've got our index route up and running here, it's rendering a template. So here I want to try and contact the API. So I'm going to go back to their documentation. I remember they had a really great example showing me how to do that. Documentation, where was it? Sample code. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this right into my application. So first of all, the imports definitely don't go inside of the route handler. Put those guys over there. So one problem we're going to run into is just with language here, that we're using the terms request and response in kind of different ways. Previously, we've been using these variable names request and response to deal with the request coming into our API and the response that we send to our client. But now our backend is also sending a request and getting a response from some other API. So we're going to need to be mindful of the variable names we use so we don't get confused. So instead of response, I'm going to call this API response. And so then the regular response is going to be like our response to our user. And then also request. That's going to get a little bit confusing with the requests library. So I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but requests is a library that we're going to use for sending API requests from our backend. So it's very similar to Axios, which we use from the front end for sending API requests, except we're going to use this from our backend with Python and Django. But given how similar the name is to this request parameter, I'm going to use an alias. I'm going to say import requests as HTTP client, because that's what it is. That's what it's doing. It's sending requests. So we're going to say API response equals HTTP client.get endpoint auth is auth. Great. Going to print the API response. Okay, but there's still some issues here. We're getting a lot of squiggly text going on up here. So one problem is that my editor doesn't know which virtual environment I'm using. So it doesn't know that we have Django installed and that these are actually defined. So the way I can fix that in my editor, I'm going to go down at the bottom over here. It says Python, select language mode, click on that bad boy. Or actually, okay, not that one. I'm going to click on right next to it where it says 3.9.10. This is which version of Python my editor thinks that I'm
down a
using.
bit. I can't see it down there. I don't know if I'm the only one who can't see that.
No, there might be others.
If you press
about
Alt
now?
on your keyboard, it should hide the bar, which will allow you to see the bottom of the screen.
Oh, okay. Me, right?
Pardon?
Yeah, Alicia, if you press your Alt, or if you're on a Mac, it should still be Alt, but if you press Alt, it's going to hide the zoom controls, and then you can see the bottom of the screen.
Thanks.
Does that help? Are you able to see what I'm hovering over here?
Yeah, sorry. I guess I could have done it on my own, but thanks.
No worries. I didn't know that either. But anyway, this is showing which version of Python my editor thinks it's using. This is the system Python, which, like we said before, we don't want to use this. We want to be using our virtual environments. So I'm going to click on that guy. Click to enter a path. Okay, so that found it. Usually it just like auto completes with your virtual environment, but maybe it's just because I typed it in before they remembered it. So now when I just click on this list here, it's just going to show me all the different versions of Python that I've used in the past in VS Code. And so this is going to be in the list. My wishes env. So now, why is this still here? Can I not just like, anyways. Sometimes modern editors frustrate me a little bit, especially Microsoft products. But anyways, so now we don't have the squigglies over these and like the Django modules, because I've told my editor that which virtual environment we're using, and it actually has those. But these still have squigglies because these are not built in and I have not installed them yet. In fact, we're getting an error down in the console, says no module name requests. So I'm going to fix that by installing it into my virtual environment. So I'm going to confirm here real quick. I'm in my wishes environment. I will pip install requests. And then we're also using requests OAuth lib for the authentication. So requests is just a basic library for sending an HTTP request, but to do the authentication specifically, there's another kind of add-on library for that. So I just have to install it separately. Awesome, so now that is installed. And in theory, that should get rid of those squigglies because they are now available in the environment, but whatever. Okay, yeah, so now my server is no longer complaining that those don't exist. Refresh the page, everything is still good. Okay, so cool. I've installed these new modules that I'm using. Now I need to fix up this example code. They're showing us how we can authenticate, but they have placeholders for the API keys. So I'm just going to paste my keys into there. My key. And then my secret key goes in the other one. So you can see here actually that we already made a request to the noun project, and they sent us this 401 unauthorized because we didn't have our key included. It was just asterisks. So now we have our actual key. Let's see what response we can get from the API. Gonna refresh the page again here. So that loads our index route. And it looks like we got some data here, but this is going to be really hard to read just because it's all minified. So like I said before, it's one of the challenges in working with APIs is they give you so much data and you have to know how to like parse through it, read, find what you want. And this was easier in JavaScript because we could use the browser to interactively read through the responses. But in Python, we're going to have to take a different approach. So there's a couple ways that you can go about this. One is I like using this built-in module in Python called prettyprint. It's another way to print things that makes it look a little bit prettier. So that's pprint is prettyprint. And then I have to make a specific printer. It's an object-oriented class. So I'm going to say pp equals pprint dot prettyprinter, and then we give it some options. So again, the whole point is to be pretty, it's to be legible. So I'm going to say I want to use 2 space indentations in order to read the output. And then also very importantly is depth. So this is saying, don't print more than 2 levels deep for the API response. So the response is going to have like dictionaries in lists, in dictionaries, in lists, etc., nested very deeply. But I don't want to see like the deepest data. I just kind of want to get like a really quick high level overview of what data is included. So I only want to see what's 2 levels deep in this response. Oh, also one other thing, just forgot. So we're going to transform the API response into JSON. See what that looks like real quick. Okay, so here's the raw response, the JSON response. So it looks like minified JSON, very hard to read. And then this is the pretty response. Doesn't show you the full data. Like here, just tells us that collections is a list because it's not going to go more than 2 levels deep. But this is deep enough that I can see, oh, there's a preview URL here. That's probably going to be useful because I'm trying to find an image. Then there's a bunch of other data here, but I don't really care about it. So that was kind of cool. I wonder if we could also, I'm going to try this real quick. I'm going to use the debugger, see if this is going to help me out. I don't always use the debugger for debugging web applications. There are a lot of situations in which it's not going to be as helpful as you might hope. But for stuff like this, where I've just got a big object and it's got tons of data, I don't know what's what, the debugger can potentially be helpful with that. So I just clicked run and debug, saying specifically I'm debugging a Django application. So that's pretty convenient. VS Code knows how to debug Django applications specifically. I don't have to like set this up.
Also, while you're looking at that, you mentioned you didn't want to go too deep, which is why you set it equal to 2. If we were just on our own, had printed the, I think it was the API response, how by looking at the response would we know to set those values?
How would I know to set it to 2?
Yeah, the indent and the depth.
I don't know. I just think 2 is a good number. I just figured 3 would be too much information and 1 would be not enough information.
But I mean, if we're looking at it, how would we know where the information we want? Like, so we just, how do we know if we're not just going deep enough? Excuse the laughter.
So like, okay, there's something wrong with my folder structure here. So the debugger isn't working how I'm hoping it would. So I mean, ask yourself, like, what are we using the API for? You know, like in this case specifically, I want to get an image. So I would look at the response 2 levels deep and ask myself, you know, does anything here look like it might contain an image URL? Like maybe there's a key for like image previews or like preview links or something. So in this case, it shows me the information I'm looking for, so I don't have to go any deeper. But if I didn't see what I was looking for, I would, you know, try to look at what I can see and wonder if maybe what I'm looking for is in one of those keys, and then make this depth of 3.
Gotcha.
Look
Thank
a
you.
little deeper in. And in theory, the debugger would also help with that. But it seems like VS Code is kind of confused about what the root of my project is. So I guess I should create a launch.json file in order to
What are your
customize
thoughts
this.
on like print statements and debugging that way?
Sometimes it's all you get, and I think it's all I need. It's definitely like a kind of barbaric and low tech way to debug things. But seriously, like I want to discourage you from becoming dependent on your debugger. There are a lot of people that I've met who just don't know what debugging is if they're not using a debugger. And there are many types of problems that you just can't investigate with the debugger. Like a debugger is great for trying to understand code that's happening on one machine, but any problem in a web application that's like actually a serious problem that, you know, a developer can't just fix immediately in like 15-20 minutes, like something that's going to really take multiple people looking at it and like a day of 2 of effort or more. Any of those serious problems are going to involve code on multiple different computers, in which case it's, you know, very hard to debug one process that happens on multiple computers. Or it's, even if it happens on one computer, it's going to be a process that involves timing. So you might have bugs with the user interface where, you know, the user is clicking on things and moving their mouse in real time, and other things are being processed in the background, and maybe they're being processed in the wrong order. As soon as you turn on the debugger, you're pausing your application and you're changing the timing of these events. So if you have a bug that is specifically related to timing, the debugger is likely not going to reveal that to you. And again, from my career, all of the most serious bugs I've had to deal with have dealt with like precise timing, race conditions, or like asynchronous code on multiple different machines. All different situations where the debugger would have just been useless to me. So for smaller problems, and especially when you're learning, it can be very helpful. But for the most dire situations, it's not going to be an option. That's my kind of 2 cents on that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I agree. And I tend to use print statements more often than not because it's really fast. And I can see, like, I can print what I want and I can like see the flow of the data through the program, which is super helpful for the kinds of things that you're describing too. Like, you know, you might have to have like 2 separate terminals open, but it helps a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely people who have like a poor opinion of print statement debugging, and they'll like give you a weird look about it. But in my opinion, like those people are just principled idealists, and they've never actually had to debug a messy application in serious circumstances.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I'm sure there are cases where it makes a lot more sense to use a debugger, but so many people I know use print statements.
So I'm trying now to just customize this debugger a little bit to let it know where the actual root of my project is. So I'm hoping this will let me run the debugger here. But if not, we're just going to move on. Port is already in use. I have to close this server because the debugger runs its own server. Okay. And then the views, I put a breakpoint over here. Refresh the page, loads the breakpoint. Okay. So here in the debugger, I can see the response JSON. looks like it has an icon key, is like one key that contains the entire rest of the thing. It's got attribution, multiple collections inside of it. But most importantly is the icon URL or the preview URL. For some reason, you don't always have an icon URL from this API. I'm not really sure why, but the preview URL is always available. They've got tags, so you can find related images, I guess. Figure out where it came from. So yeah, sometimes it's nice to use the debugger to explore large API responses, but it's not something I do every day.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, so I've got my template set up. It's not doing anything interesting. I would like to use the data from the API in my template, actually. I'm going to send that down to the client. So from looking through the response, actually, I'm going to go back to their API Explorer. Okay, so the data I'm looking for is in the icon property and the preview URL. So let me just see if I can print out just that. I'm not going to print out all this information. Response JSON. I'm pretty sure this is a dictionary. So we're going to look at icon preview URL, right? Icon preview URL. Okay, let's try that. Oh yeah, here it is. So this is the preview URL. Just click on that. Shows us picture of person throwing out trash. Amazing. So now that I know I can access the preview URL, let's assign that to a variable. Now when we render the response, we will pass in a dictionary, preview URL. Dalton?
Yeah, I'm just curious because I can't remember exactly how I did it, but I had an error. Is it not possible to pass in more than one like dictionary in the response?
You can only, when you're rendering here, you can only pass in one dictionary.
Okay.
But each of the values for those keys could themselves be other dictionaries. So there isn't really a limit on how much data you pass in. You just have to organize it, right?
Cool. Thank you.
Let's get that breakpoint out of there.
So I got a little confused too, as like, why do you need, so it looks like you're creating a dictionary with the key of preview URL and the value is the actual preview URL dictionary itself. Why can't you just pass in just the preview URL as a dictionary and access its stuff like you do preview URL dot whatever?
I mean, isn't that what this is? How do you mean preview URL as a dictionary?
Well, I guess I'm just asking you, why is that first part required? Why can't you just pass in the dictionary since it's already a dictionary?
What's
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, actually. I can just do it this way. It's fine.
I mean, I could pass in the entire response JSON, but that's probably a lot more information than my template needs.
Yeah. Sorry, just ignore my question. It's fine.
No,
But kind of on Alicia's point, actually. So if I want, like, I was trying to pass two things in, would I have had to, like, could I not just do a comma right there? Would I have to pass in a whole? Okay, I must have like a syntax error. Then I don't know.
could be.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so let's go to our template now. Going to use that preview URL. Cool. So now we are sending a request from our front end to our back end. The back end is sending a request to the API. API is coming back with an image URL. Our back end is sending that URL to our front end, which is getting interpolated into a IMG tags source. Of course, this isn't so interesting. We're not actually wishing for anything. It just gives us garbage when we load the page. So let's make this a little bit more interactive. We're going to use the query string here. Say equals request.get wish.
I see.
I think we can short circuit in Python like this. So let's see here. Oh, right. And then we actually have to use this. Cool. So by default, if there's no parameter in the query string for wish, then wish is just fish, and we put our fish wish in the endpoint and we search for it, and that's what gets sent back to the client. Or we can type in whatever we want. We want a potato, amazing. Want a cat, got a cat. Earth, that is not what I was expecting. That's a little better. I don't know, what do we want to see?
Can you type NES? Wow. Wow.
That's pretty cool.
I like it.
What happens if you type Raphael?
Type
Yeah.
You can type vacation.
Nice.
Which color is Raphael, of the Ninja Turtles?
He's the red one.
Red one. All right.
Mm-hmm.
type God.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
So on that note, we got our API working correctly, it seems like, proxying the requests from our front end through our back end to the API. But now there's one more topic that we need to discuss, and that's the secret management. So like I was saying before, where did I put that? So this is not good. I cannot push this up to GitHub the way my application is currently, because you cannot put secret keys in Git. That's just a big no-no. Like automated robots are going to detect them and shame you. Your teammates in code reviews will shame you. like do not put keys in Git. So that's the next thing we need to talk about, is how to not do that. I think this is a good time for a break though. I don't think I'm going to need a full 35 minutes for this last topic. So it's 11:26. Why don't we come back at 11:35? So slightly short break, I apologize. But let's come back at 11:35 and we'll finish up today's lecture about secret management. So the last thing we need to talk about today is secret management. So long story short, don't ever put keys or other secrets in GitHub or in Git. And what we're going to do instead is use environment variables to supply credentials to our app. So for a refresher for y'all's, environment variables are basically just variables that are defined at the command line on your machine, your environment. So if you want to view them, you just go to the command line, type env, and this shows you all of the environment variables that you have defined currently. So basically, this is where we would put like API keys, database passwords, other sensitive information would go in the environment. And also any information that is specific to that environment where the application is running. So, you might deploy your application to a staging environment, which is going to be a little bit differently from how it works in the production environment where your customers are actually at, which is going to be a little bit different from how it runs in your local environment on your machine. And so those are all going to be the same code base, same branch of code that you check out from GitHub. But the difference is that they are in different environments. So any difference in how your application runs locally versus in production versus in staging, those differences are described in environment variables. Now, practically speaking, though, we're not actually going to be setting variables in Bash at the command line in order to give those secrets to our application. But there is another way to go about this. We're going to create a file called an Env File. And that file is going to store all of our secret keys. So to show you what I'm talking about, in my index here, let's just print real quick. I need to import OS. Refresh the page real quick. All right, so here's my environment. This is what Python thinks my environment is, os.environ. This should look familiar. This is the exact same thing I just saw at the command line when I typed env. It's just about who you're asking. Before I asked Bash, what's my environment? Here I asked Python, what's my environment? And they're both giving me the same answer, just formatted a little bit differently. But what I would like to do is create a file for my environment so I can have extra variables that Python can see when it checks os.environ.
I'm sorry, is this specifically your virtual environment or no?
So this is another one of those times when programming gets confusing because we're going to use one word in multiple ways. So everything that I'm talking about now has nothing to do with Python virtual environments. Using environment in a completely different context. This is just talking about the variables that are defined in the CLI when you type env. Okay.
Yeah, and generally speaking, we'll use the word environment to describe the context the program runs in, and thus all these variables. Like when a program runs, what is it running in? Is it running in the shell environment? Is it running in the browser environment? Is it a Python virtual environment? And Raphael, like you were saying, there can be a lot of confusion because like a Python virtual environment is pretty lightweight, you know, versus a virtual machine or the browser or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I'm going to what am I going to do? I'm going to create an env file. Customarily it is called .env. And then inside of this file, I'm just going to put some key value pairs. So commonly env, say for example, it's prod. I guess in this case, I'm just doing this on my local machine. So I should say env is dev. Because generally you're going to do different things with the application in local development versus production deployment. So for example, maybe you send users an email when they sign up. You're probably not going to do that when you're just testing it locally. So when the app runs in dev mode, it doesn't send any emails. But when it's in prod mode, env equals prod, then you do actually send emails for the appropriate events. But also importantly here,
and this file is where you define what happens in the local versus production environment, this file right here.
This is where you define if it is local or production. I'm just setting a variable. Env is dev, prod, staging, something like that, development or production. And then in the rest of the code, you might have some if statements like if .environ.
Yeah, and actually something really valuable that to mention is there's the term environment variable. And in that .env file, each of those lines, we're defining an environment variable that, as you can see, is like a variable in the environment in which we're executing this Django program, running this Django server. And thus we can like access it the way that Raphael is showing us right now with like OS is short for operating system. So we're saying, hey, Django program, reach out to the environment and look for this specific environment variable. And we define those in that .env file. And some the shell gives us. And sorry if that was a digression. And Dalton, that's correct. You would never ever push a .env file to GitHub. There is a file called gitignore. If we haven't touched on it, where you can tell Git what you want to ignore, and that's what you do. Often you'll see like a .env example file, which will have like the names of the env variables that a program needs to run, and like some fake values.
That's a really great observation. That's actually the very next point that I need to make here in this demo, is that now I've got this other file that has my secrets in it. But if I do git status, excuse me. Where did I just put my .env file? Oh, is it outside of this all?
Yeah.
Okay, env.env. Wishes project. So git status might not be showing me exactly what I want to see, because this entire demos folder is a Git repository, not just the wishes project. And this entire folder has been added since my last commit. So what I wanted to show you basically is that the .env file is currently being tracked by Git, which is not what should be happening. Git should have no knowledge of this file. So the way that we handle that is with a git ignore file. So in the root of the project, I'm going to create a new file called .git ignore, and then I just list a whole bunch of files or folders in here, and Git will basically ignore anything that I name here. It will not add it or commit it or track it in any way. It just pretends like it's not in the folder. So definitely .env is a really important one to ignore. Later on, when we get to more React development, we're going to see some other stuff like node modules. All you Mac users are probably going to want to put like a DS store in there. This is just a file that Mac OS creates automatically that you don't want to put in GitHub. Basically, any just random junk on your computer in your project folder that doesn't belong in GitHub, or any secrets that doesn't belong in GitHub, you put it in the git ignore file. And then the git ignore file does get tracked in Git.
Is PyCache something that can go in there? Or does that need to go up?
Yeah, that should go in there too. What, like that. There's some special syntax for like finding something in subfolders. So you can describe patterns of things with the git ignore. I haven't gotten too sophisticated with it, but there are different ways you can name things. Anyways, so I've got my env file. It is being ignored in GitHub. So I can safely commit this repo now. Well, not yet actually, because my keys are still here. So the next thing I need to do is instead of just hard coding the keys right in there, I need to read them from the environment. So I'm going to have to use another Python package in order to read this .env file. So we're going to hit install python.env. So it's just a package in Python for reading a .env file. Pretty straightforward. And then in my code here, we're going to import this function load.env. Let me just make sure that this worked. I want to print os.environ API key. Because in my .env file, that's one of my keys here, API key. So I want to see if I can print that out. Because in theory, if everything worked correctly, all of the variables in this env file should be added to the environment, os.environ. And it seems it is not. What is going on here? Oh, I didn't actually use it. Okay, so I imported the function load.env. I need to actually load the .env. And that should really happen outside of the view handler, really just at the start of my server loading. So we're just gonna load.env. Doesn't take any arguments because it is assuming that there is a file called .env in the root of my project. That's just such a strong convention for these types of files. I don't need to configure it. Just call the function and it does what it does. What is going on here? Oh, right. So the request is failing because I don't have the keys in there anymore. So that is to be expected. But what I'm looking for here is when we look for the env and I try to print os.environ API key, now I can see it. So it looks like because I did load.env, the variables in my env file, API key and secret key, are now available on os.environ. So I just have to plug those in here. And the other one used the secret key. Okay, so that actually works. Amazing. But now this is actually like a more properly built application that I can push up to GitHub without immediately losing my job or whatever. So I'm actually going to do that now just to show you it's safe. Missing anything? No. All right, so yeah, that is how we use APIs from the backend. That's all the content I've got for you today. We've got a couple of homework assignments for tonight. We're gonna follow up on the Pokemon theme team, have you do it from the backend now. So it should be basically all the same logic. It's just that now you're gonna have to go through a couple of extra steps because instead of sending the request from the front end, you send the request from the front end to your back end to the Pokemon API, to your back end to your front end again. So same goal, but using different tools now. And then we've also got an API show and tell, where you're not going to be building on a full application. I just want us to try to authenticate to an API. And I'm hoping that all of us will choose different APIs to make it interesting. So again, there's this list on GitHub, free public APIs, a lot of good choices here. Let's see, I'm really into entertainment, why not? And so now for this API, or for this assignment, you'll be able to use any API, whether or not it supports cores. So before we were limited to only using APIs that say yes for cores, because those can be used from the front end. But now that we know how to send requests from the back end, even if it says no for cores or unknown, we can still use that API. But for your homework tonight, I specifically want you to use an API that requires some form of auth. So, you know, either API key or some of these say OAuth, I think. Yeah, so this guy says OAuth, some of these say API key. Just the whole point is I want you to get practice with reading the docs and going through the authentication. So don't use any of the APIs that have no authentication. But other than that, a lot of choices here. Michael, did you have a question?
Yeah, so what's the difference between OAuth and API key? And do you have to implement them differently than how you did it in the notes today? Because in the notes, it looks like you did OAuth. What would the implementation be different for just one that says API key?
I mean, honestly, I think it would be pretty similar. Like OAuth is a very specific authentication technology, but as you saw, logging in with OAuth still required a private and public key. So I'm not exactly sure what distinction they're drawing here. I think this might be just more vague, more general, like requires some API key. Maybe it's not specifically OAuth. Long story short is just read the documentation, and that's going to tell you how to use that API in particular. Terrence?
Yeah, I think I did try and use an OAuth a while ago, and it said something about needing an account to even access it. So are we going to need to make an account for this homework?
Probably, yeah.
All right.
Figure like a lot of these APIs, like they can't handle an unlimited amount of traffic. So maybe they can handle, thousands of people sending requests every hour or whatever. But if one person is sending 1,000 requests every minute, that's going to overload the API and make it inaccessible to other people. So they need you to register and identify who you are so that if you're sending too many requests, like they can just ban you from the API. Like a lot of these won't take your billing information. So it's not like they can just charge you for usage. If you're abusing it, they're just gonna, ban your API key basically. What other questions do we have?
I had a quick question. So what's the difference between a normal API and a REST API? Because when I was doing the API stuff last week, I saw REST API. When I looked it up, all it said was that REST APIs conform to like REST constraints, but I didn't really know how they work or if they're any different than a normal API.
Yeah, so we haven't talked about this in too much depth yet, just because I didn't want to get us all hung up on like the academic aspect of APIs. I wanted to just like send and receive data and do some fun stuff. But you might notice that there are certain conventions that many API developers take when they build their APIs in terms of which methods do you use for different requests, get versus post versus put versus delete. There are conventions about how you write the URLs. There are conventions about what status codes you should send back. And other aspects of APIs have various conventions that are part of what's called RESTful API design. So they say the more of these conventions that your API follows, the more RESTful it is. And the more other developers are going to already know how to use your API without reading the documentation. So it's really just about doing things the conventional standard way so that everybody else knows how to use your API. Now, inevitably, they're going to have to read the documentation to some extent, but ideally, they shouldn't have to read the docs to know every little detail about your API. But as much as possible, they should be able to rely on their past experience as a developer. And so, and that standard, that convention that every developer is at least somewhat familiar with, this kind of common ground is REST. And so at the end of this program, I'm going to talk in much more depth about what exactly a REST API does specifically beyond just what any API would do. And I do think that's an important topic for interviews, because that is definitely something that I have been asked about specifically many, many times and have been denied many jobs in the past because of my inability to like speak to an interviewer's concerns or interests about RESTful API design. But like over the years, I made a point of getting better at understanding this. And anytime an interviewer told me like, oh, like you don't know this one thing about RESTful API design, like get out of here. You can't work in this place. Like you got to know REST. Like every time they told me something like that, I made a point of looking up what it was they were talking about, trying to see what other people's opinions are and how it's used and whatnot, so I could talk more intelligently about that in the future. And so nowadays, when I interview for things, people ask me about REST, I basically just monologue at them for 15 minutes, give them way more of an answer than they hoped for, than they expected. And they say, like, I guess this guy knows his stuff about RESTful APIs. And then we move on and talk about something else. I've also had a few students in the past who like applied for jobs immediately after hearing my RESTful API lecture. And even before they had a portfolio or any like personal projects or whatever. And they were basically just offered jobs on the spot because interviewers were so impressed that a junior developer can talk intelligently about RESTful API design. Because like it's something that everybody uses as a developer, and many of us have like intuitions about how they work. But I mean, for one thing, many people's intuitions are wrong. And in general, lots of developers aren't really able to speak intelligently about RESTful API design. It's just kind of this fuzzy thing that they do practically. So when we come to that point at the end of the curriculum, I'll be really happy to teach you all the specifics, the details about what a RESTful API should and should not do. But for now, we're just kind of going to be cowboy coding our APIs, just trying to get them to work. So again, that's probably way more of an answer than you were asking for, but does that help?
Yeah, and just to clarify, so for the purpose of our assignment, RESTful APIs just work like any other API, or how we would handle them would work the same as how we would handle any other API.
Right. Yeah, the fact that it's a RESTful API doesn't really impact how you're going to use it, I guess. Yeah, because either way, like you would just read the docs and write the methods that they tell you to the URLs that they tell you to. But depending on what like schemes or patterns the method and the URL follow, it might be more or less RESTful. So not something you need to worry about for now. And honestly, probably every API you're going to use is a RESTful API to some degree. Some of them are very RESTful, like the Pokemon API, I'd say is very RESTful. GitHub's API is very RESTful. Some of them are not very RESTful. They maybe follow a few of the practices, the principles of a RESTful API, but they do it inconsistently. They don't follow all of them. Yeah, I hope that helps. We'll definitely talk about this much, much more later on in the program. John?
Yeah, so I'm seeing the term endpoint come up a lot, and I'm not sure I fully understand it. Does that just basically mean like the URL that you're typing into your browser?
Yes.
Or that you're clicking on? Okay.
Yeah, it's a specific URL that a server is prepared to handle. So I guess kind of another way of thinking about that is I would say, oh, better yet, we'll go to the URLs. Every entry in the URLs file is an endpoint. So if I want to know, like, what are the endpoints in my application, I'm just going to go, well, so this one isn't going to show them because this is like a table of contents. But this one is going to show the endpoints that are available in the polls app. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so would the endpoint be that first part, the first parameter in the path, or would it be the actual method like views.detail?
I'd say it's the URL.
Okay.
So right. polls/question ID/results is an endpoint.
All right, thank you.
What other questions have we got? No more questions? All right, well, in that case, I think that concludes today's lecture. So thank you, everybody, for coming up, being attentive, asking questions. It's a lot of fun for me. Hope you all enjoyed it too.